We have the enviable slot to entertain you following lunch, and we've been talking about our commitment to be a snappy panel. We're looking forward to the conversations with you. We are talking about a theme which is fairly dark and which notes some of the underlying regression in protection of rights in a very serious way. But we will be looking for those moments of light, and we'll look forward to you to ask those questions that we've been hearing about where do we see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I will start by introducing the panelists, and I will tell you what we've agreed as our ground rules. Each speaker will speak for 7 minutes, except for Joelle, who was our last speaker on blasphemy. We'll have just a few more minutes. I will start playing a tone after, when there's 1 minute left for each speaker. That doesn't mean that the time is out. So this is not the Academy Awards. Nobody's going to get blasted off. But in a sincere effort to keep ourselves to time and have the time for conversation after. So our first speaker today is Adam Weiss, who we honored last night with the Colombia Freedom of Expression Award. We'll hear a bit about the cases that have gone into the reason that the award was conferred. Adam has been the legal director of the European Roma Rights Center since 2013. Prior to that, he was with the AIR Center based in London. Throughout his career, he's been working particularly on behalf of migrants and the rights of the vulnerable. At European Roma Rights, he's been working on behalf of Roma, but also other despised or vulnerable communities. Next, we will have speaking Alexandra Brickowski, who is the director of the Sova Center for Information Analysis based in Moscow. And he is vice president of Panorama Information and Research Center from 1991 to 2002. He's worked on issues of political extremism, nationalism, xenophobia, has authored a number of articles and books, including State Policy Towards Ultra-Nationalist Organizations in 1991-2002, and then also Criminal Law in OSCE countries against hate crimes, incitement to hatred, and hate speech. Next speaking will be Bernard Harcourt, who is joining us from Colombia. Glad that he has walked across the courtyard. Sulzbacher, professor of law, professor of political science, executive director of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. His scholarship intersects social and political theory, and he has authored a number of books. His most recent is called The Counter-Revolution. It will be on display. And it's been creating quite a buzz. And we will hear about the theories and tactics that he's exploring in that book. Next to speak will be Fisa Patel. She is the director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. She has led advocacy campaigns on a number of issues, including opposing dragnet surveillance of Muslims and state laws designed to incite fear of Islam. She campaigned for legislation to create the Independent Inspector General for the New York Police Department. She's written a number of articles and books and is a frequent commentator. Following Fisa, we'll have Yasmin Ahmed from the UK, Director of Rights Watch UK since April 2014. Before that, she worked for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, for the Australian Attorney General's Department on issues concerning asylees and refugees, at the ICTY, and at the Serious Crimes Unit for Timor-Leste. She has taught public law. She is a solicitor of England and Wales, and also a barrister and solicitor in Australia. And in the middle and last of our speakers will be Joelle Fisk, a researcher an analyst based in Geneva with 15 years of experience on human rights and foreign policy. Before working in Geneva, she was based with Human Rights First here in New York, and also with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats at the European Parliament. She focuses on security, conflict, human rights, and identity issues, and most recently been working on freedom of religion and belief and how it's being tested. So we will start with Adam Weiss to hear from the view from Hungary.
Thank you so much, and I'm setting my stopwatch so I don't go over time. Thank you so much to the organizers for letting me come and speak with you, not only for professional reasons, but also because it means that my mother can be here to see me speak, which is unusual, and I'm pretty sure she thinks I work for the CIA, so this is good to clear my name. I want to do two things in this time that I have. I wanted to discuss who is a radical or who is a radicalized person in Central and Eastern Europe, and I'm really thinking about Hungary in particular, but the region more generally. And the second thing I want to do is talk about what European law has to say about the rights of these people who are viewed as radical and the rights of the people that they are or viewed as targeting. I think in Central and Eastern Europe and in Hungary in particular, there are three groups of radicals or radicalized people. The first is kind of a fantasy group. It's the radical immigrant, the radical Muslim who exists in the mind of politicians who want to close the region to all refugees, to all people who are migrating, to all migrants, which has become really a dirty word in Hungarian in particular. I say that this is a fantasy because I don't think that these people exist in Hungary or other countries in the region. But there is one example, one scapegoat, a person named Ahmed H. And if you Google Ahmed H. Hungary right now, you'll get a lot of information about this person who is a Syrian citizen and a recognized refugee in Cyprus who lived for a long time in Cyprus and is currently serving a prison sentence in Hungary for terrorism offenses. It's a grotesque case that will eventually, I think, soon enough make its way to the European Court. But he was essentially imprisoned for holding a bullhorn during a difficult situation at the Hungarian border and calling people to calm down. The second group, I think, is the actual radicals or radicalized people, probably people that we would all agree meet that definition. Meet the definition of those terms. These are people, I would call them white nationalists, although that's the American way of referring to them. I don't think in Europe they'd be called white nationalists. They might be called far right-wing extremists or racist extremists. I'm talking about organized groups who hold a racist ideology and who engage in organized activity in order to intimidate ethnic minorities. In Hungary in particular, there are organized groups that have marched, particularly in Romani neighborhoods, who have threatened people, who wear military or military-style uniforms, who have names like the Hungarian Guard, or names that include words like protection and national. They've calmed down recently. I don't completely know why. But when I first started working for the ERRC, these marches were quite common. They were still going on back in 2013 in Hungary, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia. We haven't seen many of them lately. That's not to say that there aren't plenty of racists operating in these countries and plenty of hate crimes, but this kind of organized marching doesn't happen so much anymore. But one story that I'll come back to was a march that took place in 2011 in a Hungarian town called Gyöngyöspata in the Roma neighborhood, where these, I would call them white nationalists or extreme right-wing organized militants were marching in a Romani neighborhood and threatening the people there. And the third group is a kind of constructed group of radicals. These are the NGO people. These are people who dare to counter government narratives, particularly right now on migration. And what's happening to these people is that they are being cast as enemies of the state, particularly in Hungary. They are, and I think that they are a kind of constructed radical. The radical narrative is there. They're viewed as people who are kind of activated or contaminated, people who appear to be among us, but are somehow touched by outside forces, the outside force mainly being George Soros, and the Open Society Foundations. They're viewed as people, their main crime is in Hungary is that they want to break down the fence. There's a fence along the southern border with Serbia to stop the flow of people coming into the country to claim, to make their way into the EU to claim asylum. And they're being intimidated right now through attacks on kind of two ways. One is through scare tactics. So a few weeks ago, a magazine called Figaro published the names of people who work for organizations funded by George Soros. The organization I work for was not on that list, but if you go on our website, you won't find our staff page active right now, because like many of the other NGOs in Hungary, we took down that page, which only fuels the CIA theories that my family has about me. But the other attack is through NGO laws. So there are laws being proposed in Hungary. There's already one that went through about foreign-funded organizations. So foreign-funded organizations have to register and be labeled as such. And there will be another law that will be passed soon that will tax the income of NGOs, the grants they receive. So those are the three categories of radicals. And quickly, because I see my time is running out, I want to say how European law applies to these groups. Well, for Ahmed H. and the fantasy group, I think this will be a test for European justice when Ahmed H's when his case comes before the European Court of Human Rights. In terms of the white nationalists, we have an EU framework decision that requires EU member states to criminalize incitement to racial hatred. But in terms of the European Court of Human Rights and what that court has done on these issues, I think we have an almost kind of American story here. We have a case in Hungary, Vona versus Hungary, where the authorities shut down one of these groups, and the European Court of Human Rights said, that's fine for you to do that. That group doesn't have a right to exist, a racist group, and actually quoted US Supreme Court case law, Virginia versus Black, on that. But we also have a case about that march I mentioned in Gyöngyöspata, about a Romani woman threatened in her front yard by an axe-wielding thug. And the court basically found that the Hungarian authorities did a pretty good job of keeping the peace during those marches. So they found a violation, but it was a fairly minor violation. I can tell you more during question and answers. And what about this third group, the NGOs? The people being radicalized or being cast as radicals by the authorities. Well, there's plenty of ECHR case law protecting people who challenge the state. But I don't know how people can take advantage of that case law in order to combat the ways that they're being intimidated right now. So what can they do against the publication of names in the magazine, for example? And what can we do about these laws that are being passed, basically to try to shame, intimidate, and shut down NGOs? Here we find ourselves falling back on strange provisions of European Union law. For example, on the free movement of capital. So the right of people to make donations across borders within the European Union. We're in another realm, and a strange realm, and I think we're going to see some tests for European Union law as these radicals in Hungary in particular try to protect themselves. That's my time, so I'll finish there. Thank you.
Okay. And of course, the point of the short intro statements is that there will be time to delve more into the depths of stories. So next is Alexander, and I think you're welcome to stay at your table there. Tell us about radicalization and what's happening to vulnerable groups in Russia.
Thank you. It's easier for me to speak about Russian developments here because it's more or less, we have everything what Hungary has and more. So I will focus on what is more, and it is our very specific anti-extremism legislation and how it affects freedom of expression. The core thing here is the definition of extremism in the law, which is very wide and starts from terrorist activity and down to such things like incitement of social discord or statement of religious superiority. And this vagueness of the definition infiltrates also criminal law. So in addition to traditional article on incitement to hatred, ethnic, racial, and so on, we have very strange articles like abusing religious feelings of believers, which in fact is implemented as an anti-blasphemy law. Of course, such legislation produces clear examples of excessive limitations of freedom of speech. And these cases attract most attention. They are discussed. more or less. But I have to underline that statistically, vast majority of cases of criminal law and anti-extremism law enforcement is against ultra-right groups, propagandists of militant jihad, and other really radical groups. But of course, also some others. But the problem is also in numbers. We have more and more criminal prosecutions for speech. Just in the beginning of this decade, we had about 100 sentences per year for public statements. Then it grew up, especially after mass protests in 2012 and after beginning of Ukrainian war in 2014. Last year, we had more than 6,500 sentences a year, and not counting minor offenses. Political nature of this law enforcement is obvious. There are no cases when police officers just find some statement and starts to investigate it. No, they follow the activist, radical or not radical activist, and then they look for some materials to create a case against him or her. And at the same time, literally the same statements made by other people are noticed. I mean hundreds of literally the same statements. This extreme selectivity of law enforcement create a strange atmosphere of uncertainty and sometimes fear for, let's say, usual citizens. While radical groups at the same time are not really threatened by that because there is no any red line. Nobody can be certain that what he published is legal, and at the same time, there is nothing which is surely illegal and punishable. There are various hypotheses why it happens this way. My favorite one is that political leadership, for various reasons, insists that law enforcement system has to prosecute more extremists and terrorists, whatever it means. And if it turns not to violent action but to statements, there is no any possibility to measure effectiveness of this work except of counting criminal cases. So the number of criminal cases is naturally growing from year to year. From pure legal point of view, it means that when police investigates the case, they pay attention only to the content of the statement. They do not take into account the situation, the nature of the speaker, scale of the audience, quality of the audience, and judges just put their stamps later. That's it. All this law enforcement very quickly is shifting to internet. Now about 95% of these criminal sentences are made for statements made online. We even had to publish such leaflets for internet users how to behave safely. This law enforcement in internet is initially based on the very original Russian idea to create a list of banned materials, which supposedly is illegal to distribute. The problem is that it's easy to ban, but it's difficult to enforce it somehow if it's available online. So the next step was to start procedures to block access to, let's say, bad materials online. Mostly it's made, no, at least partly it's made without any court procedure. Last year, supposedly from 5,000 to 6,000 orders for blocking access to something were issued. And these materials are very different, starting from ISIS videos and down to announcement of peaceful local rallies. But it's law enforcement system, they want more and more power. So if previously, from 2013, it was possible to block access to the website for announcement of a rally which is not approved by local authorities, for example, doesn't matter what kind of rally. Since last year, it is possible to block access to the website just to put in hyperlink to such announcement, even if the announcement itself is not blocked. So in fact, it means that any online mass media may be blocked for some hyperlink which was put maybe several years ago and nobody can find it. Maybe you know about this epic battle between our government and Telegram messenger, which did not provide keys, and the government tries to block messenger. In fact, it blocks everything around except of it. But anyway, and now we have the new bill related to social networks, because it's impossible to block from the governmental side certain posting in social network. This bill is based on the German law, which is rather well known, but Russian version is wider, of course. Now it's just went through first reading, but I expect it will be approved in this or that version. And the same, I mean, this shift to internet may be set also, at least partly, for general pressure on civil society organizations, which I also have to mention here. Previously, it was more about foreign agents law, which everybody maybe know that it exists, but now this law lost its momentum and it's still implemented, but not so dangerous. But there are new mechanisms which are invented. For example, NGOs may be taken to court and pay fines just for putting, again, hyperlinks to materials published by so-called undesirable organizations, foreign undesirable organizations, including already mentioned Soros Foundation. And the problem is that our legislators, in the current atmosphere of anti-Western mobilization, they invent new and new laws. They invent, let's say, more laws than law enforcement system can implement. So something new happens practically every month, and it may then follow to, in fact, I don't know how far it may follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. And actually, Bernard, before you get up, I just wanted to follow up on some of the connections between Hungary and Russia. Alexander mentioned a number of trends, and I wondered, Adam, if you might comment on how those play out also in Hungary. So the criminalization of the dissemination of materials, the shift to more censorship of online speech, arbitrary and discriminatory application of laws, as well as the promulgation of new laws. And then also this very interesting issue about the attacks on civic space and civil society, the requirement to self-label as foreign agents. I'm wondering, Adam, if you could comment on how, if such laws have had an impact yet in Hungary, and then Alex, if you could have a quick comment about the environment now in Russia. How effective has this been in silencing NGOs? Because obviously you are still functioning there in Moscow. If you could give us a sense about the number of organizations that have left, and to compare what is the level of civil society activism today, say, with 5 years ago. But first I'll go to Adam for a few comments.
Sure, I think I think there is a parallel with this this fear about the internet and a desire to attack the internet or the use of the internet in order to spread messages that go contrary to what the government wants. There isn't anything that I'm aware that looks to criminalize, but there is an attempt to use civil mechanisms to restrain use of the internet. Actually, one of the few successes of recent years in Hungary was that when the authorities wanted to put in place a tax on internet use, which would have been unique in the world, there was a massive protest. People got into the streets, and it's probably the only time I can think when the government backed down on one of its legislative proposals. It shows what can make them back down, but also what will make people mobilize. But I didn't get to it, but one of the cases that we were involved in for which we were given that honor last night is a case called Yeti versus Hungary, in which we intervened as a third. But the use of the civil courts to punish people for linking to material. In that case, it was the applicant in the case is a company that owns a web portal that included a hyperlink to a video of a Romani man comparing racist thugs to Jobbik members, Jobbik being a notorious political party in Hungary. And Jobbik successfully sued for defamation, saying that the racist thugs were not Jobbik members. You've defamed us, and the Hungarian courts accepted that argument. And it's now pending in the European Court of Human Rights. So I do think that there is a parallel. It hasn't become quite as weaponized in Hungary as it is in Russia. Perhaps the Hungarian authorities aren't as keen to do something so obviously contrary to basic principles protected under the European Convention on Human Rights, but it's certainly there.
It's a difficult question, how this pressure really destroys our organizations. I would say not really much, because the pressure is perceived is very tough if to see all this law, if to take them seriously. But they are implemented so selectively that it sometimes looks like a game, not some systematic clash between two parts of society. And it's all about this selectivity. For example, in this anti-extremism law, I mentioned this idea of to ban materials. It's a short, good story to displaying how it works. Once they banned, it was completely strange decision, let's say, a slogan, Christian Orthodox slogan, which sounds orthodoxy or death, supposedly that we will stay Orthodox till death. It was banned. We have one parliament member, very conservative, who likes to wear a T-shirt with this slogan. He do it very frequently. Nothing happens to him, of course. But there are some oppositional activists who oppose him, and they published photo in their social network with this parliament member. And for publishing this photo, they paid fines because it was banned slogan. But of course, 2 or 3 persons were punished this way, while dozens or maybe hundreds of other people also published these photos. So that's, people have to decide if to take such kind of a risk or not. As we had more than 100 organizations which were put to the list of foreign agents, just maybe a couple of them really stopped their work. Others continued the same way or re-registered in another form or continued their activity as a group of, informal group of activists, something like that. So we try to continue while it is possible.
We'll have a chance to come back to the Eastern Europe, Russia context. But now moving on to the US and the UK, we will hear from the next 3 speakers. First from Bernard Harcourt, and then we'll hear from our other 2 panelists. Each will have 7 minutes, and we'll have a bit of a discussion among them before moving on to our last topic, which is blasphemy.
Thank you. And sorry I was rushing up here, but with my 7 minutes, I didn't want to lose any of them. You know, they're very valuable because I want to make 5 points in 7 minutes. It's not going to be easy. Let me start. First, I'd say that there has been a dramatic and troubling rise of radical speech and radicalizing speech in the United States in the last year and a half. Dramatic and troubling. And as Exhibit A, I would quote, for instance, the statement that President Donald Trump as candidate placed on his website, on his campaign website, which was the following. Donald Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. I think that's exhibit A of a kind of a radicalized discourse. As Justice Kagan asked of the Solicitor General yesterday if they had substituted the word Jews there, a complete shutdown of Jews entering the United States, I think people would have reacted differently. So the radicalized discourse is having its effects. And in large part, because of the circulation of discourse on the internet, and this I'd like to pick up on Alexandra's point about the importance of the internet here in shaping the flows of discourse. Now, I'd say that the internet, this is the second point, has kind of changed the landscape entirely when we think about freedom of expression. Because now we need to be thinking about flows of discourse and ways of shaping and regulating those flows of discourse rather than individual acts, individual speech acts, individual acts of expression. So we've moved from one world to another where today what is more important is not the ability to make a free expression, but the ways in which those expressions are then kind of flow through the internet, are managed, are regulated, contained, promoted, etc. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge in the digital age. Because in the digital age, we can finally see much more clearly than we did before the ways in which the regulatory mechanisms work for flows of discourse, including flows of radical discourse. And of course, here, exhibit B would be the way that Facebook deals with and the algorithms that Facebook uses to decide what goes in our news feeds, right? And so those we can study now in a way that that exposes the management and regulation of flows of expression. Now that has significantly altered the digital age, and those regulation of flows have significantly altered the way that we regulate radical speech today, or try to de-radicalize people as well. And so what's going on right now are new forms of de-radicalization by shaping speech and expression through a model of digital advertising, essentially. And so here, exhibit C, point 3, exhibit C, would be the Center for Global Engagement that the Obama administration created in 2014, and which, of course, goes on in different forms. The Center for Global Engagement, what it did was it tried to de-radicalize by identifying speech, identifying content that was more moderate, using algorithms to identify vulnerable individuals to radicalization, and then enhancing that third-party content. All of this is what is done in digital advertising, right? I mean, and explicitly it was modeled on digital advertising. Enhance the content of third parties by including photos, for instance. You know, if you tweet, you need to include a picture, then people will click on it more. Direct those enhanced third-party contents to the targeted individuals, and then in the same way that Google, Amazon, etc., monitors whether we click our things, determine whether or not the individuals who are targeted using these algorithms are actually watching, listening, reading that information. Those are new forms that are then made possible by the digital age, but change entirely the way that the flow of expression is regulated. Another fourth point, major way in which the flows are changing has to do with the use of the internet as a medium to achieve the forms of distraction that are essential to this new mode of governing that we are part of right now. This what I call the counter-revolution, what I refer to as the counterinsurgency model of governing, because as you know, that model of governing rests on three principal strategies. The first is total information awareness, made possible, of course, as a result of our exposing ourselves on social media or our involuntarily leaving digital traces everywhere we go. And the collection by Facebook, et cetera, Google, et cetera, and then the capture by the NSA. So total information awareness. Second, targeting and excluding what are considered to be the radical minority. But third, and more importantly, which is the classic strategy of counterinsurgency theory, is to win the hearts and minds of the passive masses, of the general population. And in order to do that, to win those hearts and minds, we increasingly use distraction techniques. And in part, President Trump is, of course, the master at this, at having developed a kind of daily reality TV episode way of governing, a kind of apprentice governing, where every day we're distracted by a new departure, someone else leaving the White House, some other scandal that then kind of leaves us unable, essentially, to address the real substantive issues that confront us. The fifth and final point, then, is that all of these are feeding into a new way of governing the American people at home, a way that was born abroad, and that we've domesticated and brought home, and it's called the counter-revolution. Thank you.
There we go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing, which looks at how radicalization is framed vis-a-vis Muslim American communities. I think that radicalization became a dirty word after 9/11, when it became sort of shorthand for the process by which individuals come to carry out acts of violence. And this sort of trajectory encompasses both speech and action. So the classic sort of theory that was put forward by law enforcement agencies such as the NYPD and the FBI in the sort of early to mid 2000s was that you had a population of mostly young, mostly male Muslim Americans who were vulnerable to becoming terrorists. And they, you know, may have had what they call a cognitive opening and perhaps heard some information that radicalized them, and that information could have been, you know, stories about, you know, what the United States was doing in its overseas entanglements. Abu Ghraib, for example, is often cited, or it could be listening to so-called radical preachers who, you know, put this into the context of a war against Muslims. And then these people sort of, according to these theories, sort of moved on in a kind of a funnel shape or a stairwell, or, you know, you can pick your metaphor, to eventually becoming violent. Now, the consequence of this was the push to create predictive tools, so tools that would identify amongst a nonviolent, non-criminal, but minority and distinguishable population who was going to be the next guy who strapped a bomb onto his chest and blew up something. The problem was that they were looking at very, very large sets of people. Their trajectories were not predictive in any way. There were never any control groups, sample sets, none of the sort of scientific stuff that you would expect. And because they landed up basically targeting wide swaths of perfectly normal behavior and speech among Muslim Americans. So some of the early sort of predictors that they used were things like growing a beard, which suggested you were becoming more religious and therefore you were likely to be, I mean, you laugh, but it's actually in their documents, right? Or, and I always thought this was perhaps a good thing, giving up smoking and drinking, because that suggested you were leaving your heathen lifestyle behind in order to become, you know, more religious, more devout, and more likely to be a terrorist. But it also included, political speech. If you were concerned about American foreign policy, if you were worried about, what do drone strikes do to people in Pakistan, all of these kinds of things were mashed into this discourse about how to predict. And this is the point I want to make again and again. This is not worried about descriptive analyses. I'm saying this is how to predict who's going to become the next terrorist. And then you had all these sort of theoretical discourses which were boiled down for use for police departments, right? And for the FBI. And let me tell you, there's a big difference between a nice academic paper and the checklist that the guy on the street wants to have. And that's why we get to growing a beard or, stopping listening to rap music. I mean, it was really ludicrous. So this was kind of the construct that we went into through the sort of mid-2000s. There was a lot of pushback from civil society against this construct because it was so obviously aimed at both Muslim religious observance but also at political speech. So the construct became refined over time. You go into the Obama administration, everybody thinks things are going to get better. They don't. All they do is that they become more sophisticated and more coded in the ways that they talk about, which is essentially religious and ideological profiling. So instead of having, growing a beard, you have, believes that the West is at war with Islam. Well, I would say that that's maybe not an unreasonable belief as we are in wars in several Muslim countries around the world. It certainly doesn't indicate whether or not you're likely to become a terrorist. But some of the things have been really remarkable. Things like, is concerned about human rights in the Middle East. I mean, these are things we debate on the pages of major newspapers every day. It was truly absurd. But it also gets even more coded because it becomes about mental health, and that's the most recent evolution we've seen, which is that, terrorists are basically, or Muslims are basically vulnerable to propaganda from ISIS. And it's kind of a mental health problem. And so once we identify people who we think are vulnerable, we are going to give them counseling. Because, it's not political violence, it's a kind of infectious ideology. And that's sort of the most recent iteration that we've seen in all of this. I want to make one more point, which is that, the Brennan Center where I work, recently we conducted an analysis, which we haven't yet published, of the most recent countering violent extremism grants, which were granted by the Department of Homeland Security last year. And one of the really alarming trends that we've seen is that the violent extremism narrative has extended. No, it hasn't extended to white nationalists, as you might expect. What it's extended to is every other minority community in the United States. So basically, about 60% of the grant applications that were approved start from the assumption that the experience of discrimination, whether you're black, whether you're gay, whether you're a refugee, or whether you're an immigrant, means that you are vulnerable to becoming a violent extremism. Just think about how that flips on its head everything that we work for when we work in the anti-discrimination space, and what that means in terms of the speech of communities that are already the most targeted across a range of measures and whose speech is probably the most difficult to elevate in our societal discourse. So with that, you can tell it doesn't make me happy. But let me tell you just quickly that we do have something which makes me really happy, which is that there is an incredible amount of grassroots energy pushing against these very constructs, which really started amongst Muslim communities who are incredibly savvy about what these kinds of constructs mean for their communities, and actually really amongst the younger generation. So there are, young people who organize at universities which want to take funding from the government to conduct this kind of programming. You have a lot of organizing going on in places like Minneapolis, which has a Somali community that's been very targeted by this. Los Angeles, again, there's huge amounts of energy at the grassroots level. And I think that, that and combined with sort of having an administration that is so overtly xenophobic and anti-Muslim really kind of brings all of these things together, and I think that we have a really strong pushback against these constructs.
Thank you. Great. So Yasmin will in the UK will be interested in similarities and differences, and I think that you will also show us a brief video about the countering violent extremism measures that are being undertaken in the UK. So we'll.
Thank you very much. Before I start speaking, I would just like to thank Agnes particularly and to Columbia University who've organised this speech for actually having me here, and particularly for facilitating it. I have a 2.5-month-old baby that many of you will have seen, and it was very much because of the support of Agnes and the university that I'm able to be here today to do this. So thank you for making sure that gender inclusion is a reality. I'm the executive director of an organisation that works on counter-terrorism and human rights. One of the geographic areas that we focus on is the United Kingdom, and one of the areas that we focus on is countering violent extremism. In 2016, we produced a report, Preventing Education, which is about the impact of CVE in schools in the United Kingdom. That can be accessed on our website, and also the video that I'll be showing you later. Now, what I hope to do today is run through very quickly, give you a broad overview of the UK's countering extremism strategy, and then look at the ways that it's impacting on freedom of expression. I'll look briefly at a judgment that's come out last year, which looked at freedom of expression and the policy. And then finally, just briefly, if I have time, talk about the export of the UK government's strategy around countering extremism. So first, the PREVENT strategy, which is the name of the strategy, the countering extremism strategy in the United Kingdom, is one part of a 4-part counter-terrorism strategy in the UK. It was the strategy overall was published in 2003, but PREVENT wasn't published until 2006. Really, the PREVENT strategy in countering extremism came to prominence after the homegrown terrorism threat, and as it arose, and it arose very prominently in the United Kingdom after 7/7. And the government felt they needed something to deal with the fact that there were people not only outside but within the country themselves who were carrying out terrorist activity. And I think they wanted to not only do something but seem to be doing something as well, which I think is a lot around the terrorism narrative. What we see is, though, a policy which initially came out that targeted or was openly about Muslim communities. The government funded Muslim community groups to do work within their communities. A lot of criticism about that around the communities themselves were becoming surveillance tools for the state, and the state was sucking up a lot of information about these communities. In 2011, the government actually expanded the strategy, so it included right-wing extremism as well. However, it has never applied to Northern Ireland, which is one of the places where there's a lot of extremism by the UK's definition of terrorist activity, which is quite an interesting point. Now, what I think, picking up what Fisa has said, I think what's really interesting is the UK government, in the UK government strategy and their policy, we're not dealing with countering violent extremism, we're talking about countering extremism. We're talking about person's ideologies and belief, well before there's any intention of or any complicity in or any carrying out of criminal activity. We're dealing with a pre-crime space. We're dealing with thought police, and that's really important to frame the UK government's policy around this. Now, I think a number of other governments still frame it as countering violent extremism, but in essence, when you look at it, you see that actually what we're dealing with is countering extremist thought, not actual behaviour that will potentially lead to or is in any way connected to violence. And as Fisa quite rightly pointed out, the whole policy
Well, thanks for that discussion on CVE and radicalization in the US and UK. Moving on now to a discussion of blasphemy, and with Joelle Fisk, author of 2 recent reports, one on measuring the world's blasphemy laws. Interesting methodology. Question that I had, is there a strong correlation between what you consider to be good blasphemy laws and more protection of freedom of expression in practice, or are the contextual factors even more important? And then your second report, Anti-Blasphemy Offensives in the Digital Age, when hardliners take over. I think you've got some interesting recommendations there to the tech companies and liberal democracies, if we can find any left.
Okay, thank you very much. Hang in there. You're having a coffee break very soon. and I'm with you, okay? So I'd like to thank Agnes deeply and extend my thanks to Colombia as well for inviting me to this event. And I'm here, as Sandra mentioned, to speak to you about how toxic blasphemy laws can be in the world. For those who don't know, anti-blasphemy laws call to criminalize any form of expression that insults God or the sacred. And the reason why these laws are so dangerous is because they place states as the arbiters of truth, and what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, and what is offensive and what is not. And basically they protect religion rather than protecting individuals. Now, those who are sanctioned are often citizens who are in minority positions, not unlike what we've discussed this afternoon. We are talking in particular about political dissidents, about bloggers, and there are some very interesting bloggers in the room. I call upon Hussein, for example, to discuss his blogging experience if he has time during the panel discussion. Secularists, religious minorities, their opinions have resulted in arrests, in arbitrary detentions. They have sparked assaults, murders, mob attacks. And just to give you one example of religious minorities that are persecuted in the name of anti-blasphemy allegations, to be Christian in Pakistan, to be Baha'i in Iran, to be atheist in Bangladesh, to be Ahmadi in Indonesia, or Copt in Egypt, well, you have a much higher chance of being accused of blasphemy. So there are 2 different effects that often occur. The first one is that you have a much higher likelihood of being prosecuted by the state, and you face tremendous legal pressures. And the second imminent threat that you have is that you can be attacked by mobs or individuals, and you can face tremendous social pressures of what is considered moral or indeed radical in a given society. So on one hand, the legal pressures that you face, and on the other hand, the societal pressures. Another category of people, of course, we heard Bassem Youssef last night. Many intellectuals, minority thinkers, artists, satirists are persecuted. And I must say that I fear that all rhetorical subtleties that free societies relish in, are increasingly attacked, whether it's satire, whether it's humor, whether it's hyperbole or sarcasm or provocation. Nuanced language and tones are a luxury that democracies frequently take for granted, and we all have to be careful about that. In some states, the focus shifts to how Islamist groups feel offended by the supposed crime of discussing or critiquing religion. And as I mentioned, crowds have descended on towns as well. The scenario has already played out in places like Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria. And there have been targeted assassinations of secular bloggers that have led to a string of killings in Bangladesh. What I see, and this also pertains a lot to what has been said at this panel, is that you hear, for example, in the field of blasphemy, the increasing media headline in some places of the world where militant atheists are pointed out. So for example, the non-believers are the radicals, and they're perceived as being the radicals, and they're the ones to watch out for, and they're the ones who seemingly incite to violence, and so this is bizarre because our moral compass literally turns upside down, in the sense that those who are claiming to fight against radical blasphemers are the radicals themselves. And so my key message, if there's one message that I'd like to convey, is that the term radicalization is reversed in this debate. So violent extremists take justice into their own hands in the name of fighting radicalism, and anybody who does not follow the state-sponsored religion in a specific way is accused of being a radical, which is very ironic. Now, I've been asked to describe the 2 reports that I wrote on the question of blasphemy. I don't know how much time I have, but I have never described these 2 reports in such a small amount of time, so let's try and go for it. So the first one was the one that I wrote for the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we compiled 71 anti-blasphemy laws from around the world, from regions as diverse as the Middle East and North Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas. And we examined the wording of the language of each law. And why was that important? Of course, the language of the law is important, but in particular, it provides insight to how a government perceives the question. And so that was our interest, the intent of the state's role in regulating such speech. And we tried to grade these laws, so to speak, and we developed a set of indicators, and we asked a set of questions. For example, does this law respect freedom of opinion and expression? Does it respect freedom of religion or belief? Is the law vague? Can it be subject to an abuse? What is the punishment described in this law? Is it the death penalty? Is it a fine? Is it imprisonment? Does the law discriminate between different faiths or not? Yes, so the higher the score you get, the more dangerous and risk abuse the law of that country is. Now, our findings, the most common punishment among blasphemy laws from around the world is imprisonment, with 86% of all states that impose as a maximum penalty a prison sentence. All laws without exception deviate from international standards on freedom of expression, which means, counterintuitively, if you wish, freedom of expression wasn't really a game changer in this situation of measuring blasphemy laws, because they all violate freedom of expression, to answer your question. And so as a result of that, we couldn't, assess if one law was more dangerous than another, because basically all of them, missed the points. The states with the highest scores, which are basically subject to greatest risks of human rights abuses, are number 1, Iran, as being the highest risk country in the world, number 2, Pakistan, number 3, Yemen, Somalia, and then Qatar. The states with the 5 lowest scores, subject to the least risks of human rights abuses, are number 1, Ireland, as the lowest risk country, Spain, the Philippines, Guyana, and St. Lucia. So the 3 main indicators that steeply increased or decreased was not freedom of expression, as I explained to you, but it was, first of all, the severity of the penalty. So, for example, if the maximum sentence of the crime of blaspheming is the death penalty, immediately your score goes much higher. And so as the death penalty is the maximum sentence in Iran and in Pakistan, obviously their scores went immediately much higher. Discrimination against groups. So, for example, if country X says X is the state religion, and all followers who follow a different religion are not allowed to do so, that immediately puts the population in a different position. But a lot of this report also stresses that no laws operate in a vacuum, and political context and implementation is extremely important. Public and social attitudes towards religion, the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law, law enforcement, state responses to violence, you name it. Just one last comment on this report. We did have some surprises, so we had surprises of Bangladesh. Take Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country where many times we hear about the brutal killings of atheists and secular bloggers for quite a while, but Bangladesh had a quite low score. Or so, we thought to ourselves, how is that possible? Bangladesh has a low score, and the situation we read about all the time in the media. That is because implementation, precisely. So you can't just look at the letter of the law. You also have to look at implementation. Now, I'd be happy to take more questions on this report, but I'm going to move on to the next report and to present you the findings of a Brookings report on blasphemy in the digital age. Basically, I observed cases where individuals were persecuted for what they said online about religion. They were arrested, detained, they suffered threats, harassment, violence. Now, the one example of offensive behavior on social media activities could be posting a picture or a status on your beliefs on Facebook, or liking a Facebook post of a friend, or sending a so-called blasphemous tweet or text message, or commenting on YouTube, or posting on Instagram, or even being tagged onto blasphemous content. So it's not even your fault. You were just tagged, but you're accused of blasphemy, even if you're not responsible for those actions. Of course, the internet has created this illusion of freedom, where internet users feel that they're empowered to openly voice their opinions, and maybe they anticipate less the consequences of their speech, and they would be more aware of their speech if it was offline. Another point which is very important is how expressions on the internet are broadcast at lightning speed. So everything goes much quicker. And so people's reactions are often stronger. Speech online is unaccompanied by the context of verbal expressions, of facial gestures, of any contextual commentary. So the sense of urgency and chaos can also accelerate things quite quickly. Finally, this is a bleak conclusion, and we discussed it much yesterday. Internet has created new opportunity for persecution by governments, new opportunities for persecution, new opportunities to monitor people. I have reported cases from 2014 to 2016 in Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Kuwait, Mauritania, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. But I'm aware that since July 2016, there are many more cases, such as in Algeria, Bangladesh, India, Jordan, Pakistan. So I have two more points to make. I'll just give you one example. I'd like to, for example, I don't know if some of you remember this video game that was very popular in 2016 called Pokemon Go, right? Yeah, so in 2016, three things, this is quite comical, if not upsetting, because in 3 different states, Pokemon Go was attacked on accounts of blasphemy. So in September 2016, an Indian lawyer told a court that Pokemon Go is blasphemous and should be banned because the game offends religious followers who don't eat animal products by giving players virtual eggs, all right? In September 2016, it was reported that a Russian YouTuber could face 5 years in jail after he filmed himself playing Pokemon Go in a church, and that was deemed as blasphemous. And finally, in 2016 as well, during this whole Pokemon Go craziness, Pokemon Go was declared blasphemous and Zionist by a Saudi supreme clerical body. So here we have 3 different countries, 3 different religions. We have India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and they're all using religion and technology to pursue a national agenda. So I think that's definitely worth speaking about. And my final comments, I would just like to say that the tech industry is not responsible for state persecution. It cannot prevent violent riots from erupting, and it cannot prevent violence. But, and this is a big but, everything that the tech industry does is setting a precedent. And the world is watching, and we're right now in the middle of it all, as we discussed yesterday. And companies should not be expected, in my view, to encourage or to set international standards, because that's what the job is of human rights lawyers and all other experts. It's not the job of companies, but they've committed to respecting them. And so the policies of tech companies in this particular context really can tip the balance. Facebook said yesterday that they support domestic laws. Now, and they said it, Facebook said quite unapologetically yesterday that they support domestic laws. Now, if the domestic law in place is the death penalty for blasphemy, you understand what the problem is. I personally believe that compliance to any domestic laws are problematic, and that the only solution is to uphold international standards. So that's my point for blasphemy, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Joelle. So, Agnes, let me ask you about time. We started 20 minutes late. It's now 10 minutes to 4. I can see the panelists for the next panel are here. Will you give us to 10 minutes after 2, or 10 minutes after 4? So we have 20 minutes. I'll look forward to taking lots of questions, and then we'll group them according to our sub-panels. Okay, Richard.
Is it on? Yes, it is. Hi, my name is Richard Danbury. Affiliation, I spoke earlier, but I teach investigative journalism at De Montfort University. It's all right. It's just a rider on the excellent presentation about the UK. One thing which you didn't mention, no doubt, is in your report, is there are 2 curious provisions in addition to the PREVENT strategy, which are relevant, under the Terrorism Act 2000, which create a proactive duty to report to the police various items which anyone comes across, either in relation to terrorist financing, or if you have a belief that you have information which may assist in the prevention of terrorism. And these are extra constraints as well as PREVENT, which apply well beyond PREVENT, and they have the same effect as the ones you described. So it's bothersome, to put it mildly.
Other questions or comments? And particularly looking if we see any strands that connect the 3 sub-themes of the panel. Corinna, and then Agnes. Right, just wait a minute.
Well, this is just something I've been thinking about a lot. When we talk about violence against women, when we talk about terrorism, like these sociological studies are frequently cited about speech not impacting behavior, right? Porn and violence against women, for instance, right? And the thing is that, since this is a safe space, even though it is being videoed, look, it seems to me that when we look at directed campaigns, when we look at behavior change, when we look at campaigns, for example, anti-smoking campaigns, right? There is quite blatantly and even anecdotally, you can say that, so-and-so movie inspired me to do such and such thing, right? And so I wonder whether it's something that we're not addressing adequately in terms of, whether it's in terms of radicalization, whether it's in terms of the link between speech and violence, etc. And I would love for sort of any thoughts you may have, because I think one of the sort of important functions of this space is to identify gaps in research, because while I'm a litigator, we have plenty of academics that kind of might be interested in a research agenda.
Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting in terms of all the linkages between the various presentations. And I just wanted to maybe share 2 or 3 main thoughts. The first, of course, is that what we are describing at the moment through your case studies is a global phenomena. So every society right now is defining or reconstructing its own radical. The second implication is that we can find radicals in the strangest space and in the strangest places. And I mean radicals as defined by the mainstream norms or by government. So at the moment, and it's not quite the same, but you know, I was in El Salvador not very long ago, and the gang members are not described as radical, they are described as terrorists, which I think is an interesting use of the concept, and I'm not sure this was originally what it was meant to be. So there is a global phenomenon. In my view, it is backed up by transformation of the legal framework, and we have not talked a lot about it. But there is the emergency, the phantom emergency in the United States is backed up by, in my view, the humanitarian law project and everything that flows from it, and this terrorism legal framework, which, in my opinion, is emerging, as I was talking about yesterday, as somehow as an in-between legal framework just below international humanitarian law. And in a number of contexts, you see the use of counterterrorism law as a way of not engaging with a possible reality of an armed conflict. But it's an extension and a normalization of an emergency power situation. In their latest report, the Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism has also highlighted the fact that counter-emergency regulations or emergency regulations are normally very time-specific. And what we have witnessed for the last, let's say, 5 years or so in a number of contexts is the extension months or 3 months after 3 months after 3 months. So that's the first phenomenon. And the second one, when that cannot go on, what we are witnessing is an integration of emergency power within the domestic, normal, criminal or civil law system. And that is as dangerous as the extension of it, because you have a normalization of extraordinary powers. That's the second phenomena. And then the third thing, which I take from your presentation, which will require, you know, much more time to reflect upon, is what you were talking about, which is the behavioral focus. And to me, it's one of the most recent phenomena. I may be wrong, but it appears that we are entering a period and a time where automation and a variety of data collection and data analysis is giving some people the impression that through this analysis they can not only predict behavior, which is pretty problematic, but that they can also change behavior. And it feels to me that we are entering into a very dangerous moment of social engineering driven by people with enough power to actually try it out. And I'm talking about governments. I'm talking also to a certain extent of some of the tech and social platform companies. And it's not just about predictive behavior. It's not just about predictive justice, which is what we are seeing a lot. So people are imprisoned not for what they have done, but what they may do. But it's also about changing people's behavior. An extrapolation from something very good, public health, into a domain that is far darker and has far greater implications about our democracies than the sugary drink decisions was highlighting earlier. Thank you.
Another question from Bertrand.
Yes, quickly. Generally, it was a great panel, and I want to emphasize in particular that I like the notion that was put forward by Bernard Harcourt on the flow of discourse, we don't pay attention enough to the question of the virality and the speed at which information is spreading. I just wanted to spot the expression because I think it's a very accurate one. This was really about the clear abuses and situations where the measures are disproportionate, either in the law or in the implementation, where there's a sort of alibi because of terrorism, because of the pressures, and so on. And this is all relevant. But I want to highlight what I was referring to yesterday, the distinction between this kind of problem, which is a very traditional human rights fight against abuses from governments and repressive regimes. And the other question that is sometimes left a little bit unaddressed in this environment, which is how do we deal collectively with the actual abuses by the actors who purposefully are exploiting and trying to exploit the lines of fracture to create violence and that sort of thing. And I want to throw back, without having the answer myself, the question that emerged at the very beginning of this conference in the presentation of the Ranking Digital Rights by Rebecca, which is, what do we want people to do so that we can fight the real abuses that are actually harming human rights? When there is harassment against women or minorities, discrimination, incitement to violence, and etc., this is a big human rights problem that we are confronted with because precisely there is a new environment, a new technological environment. So I want to throw back the question that we're sometimes eluding, which is that the governments, the good ones, if there are any left, yeah, there are some left. And anyway, there are people inside the governments who are trying to deal with those issues, and they're really looking for answers. And it is very difficult to provide answers. But I think this community here has a huge contribution to make to help the actors who want to find the proportionate responses to those who are trying to abuse the instruments that we cherish.
Great. Well, thanks for, I see one more question. Could it be, Andrew, could it be very brief then? We have just 10 minutes to wrap up.
Sure. My name is Andrew Smith from Article 19. My first point, sort of connecting some of these things and a challenge from a freedom of expression perspective, is the way that this concept of CVE, which doesn't have a basis in evidence and logic, has already been like rubber stamped and mainstreamed by the United Nations through the Secretary General's plan of action in this. And I think one of the challenges with that in particular is that it's the states that we normally call on to stand up for freedom of expression, like the Norway, Switzerland, the US, the UK, and others that are very much on board with that agenda, collaborating with Egypt and Saudi Arabia to see the implementation of this at the national level. And that's something that Article 19's interested in engaging in more. And I think another trend in relation to the role of private actors, I think that they could be setting a better standard by more specifically linking the issue of content moderation to actual incitement of violence. And I think the political environment has changed such over the last few years that we've seen these terms and conditions expanding to the idea of terrorist content and the idea that the most persuasive terrorist content might not be the most explicitly violent, and then you therefore see a rapid expansion of the amount of content getting taken down. And I think that insisting on those terms and conditions mirroring international human rights law standards a little bit more closely when it comes to incitement to violence would be a positive step forwards. Thanks.
Thanks. We have just 7-8 minutes for final comments, and I propose to ask the speakers to speak in the order in which they made presentations, except for Fisa. I think that you maybe need to leave first. So if you wanted to start, and just noting a number of common themes in our conversation, the questions of the identifying gaps in research, the link between speech and violence. Does standard human rights law provide us some guidelines? What do we want people to do? Or are we instead engaged in making very clear about what governments may not do, cannot do? The notion of social engineering, and is this one of the dangers that we're facing? So I turn it over to you, Fisa, to start.
Thank you. I think the questions are a whole panel discussion of themselves. But really quickly, I think this idea about the connection of speech to violence, and you brought up the domestic abuse context as well, and certainly one of the things we've seen in the context of mass violence recently is this attempt to draw a link between domestic abuse and somebody who goes on to commit an act of mass violence. And I think the thing I would say is you can look at these connections in a descriptive way, and you may find some trajectories like that. But the reality is that what governments try to do is use them in a predictive way. And you certainly have far more people in this country and other countries who abuse their wives or husbands, by far, than the ones who go out and commit mass attacks. I mean, the numbers are just completely disproportionate. You have, millions of people who have watched Anwar al-Awlaki's videos, but only a handful who actually carry out violent attacks. So I think you always have to think about, it's not that words don't matter, words obviously do matter, but what I'm concerned about is the use of words as being a predictor of particular kinds of violent behavior. And I think that's a very distinct question. That being said, I nonetheless tend to be pretty much a free speech absolutist. And I don't think you should take down al-Awlaki videos for a number of reasons, mainly because of this, but also because I think they provide us with a historical record and with something to research. And one of the things, just coming to content moderation, I think Andrew's comments were really well taken. I was having a discussion recently with somebody who's been working in the human rights field in Cambodia, and because you have so much content being taken down, one of the concerns is that documentation about human rights violations is actually being taken down in the process as well. So the downstream consequences of our attempts to have a kind of nicer, less radical society, I think, are enormous, and I don't think people have really thought through that. Lastly, I think Agnes raised a really interesting question about, data analysis to predict behavior, which is very, very problematic now, primarily, in part because, the technology isn't where they say it is, and second, because of the sort of discriminatory way in which most algorithms operate. But the idea that you can sort of use technology to change behavior, I guess I'm just a little bit skeptical, given the fact that I don't think they're that great at predicting behavior either, when you get beyond sort of simple decisions like that consumers make. And I think, we can very easily take this they're so great at figuring out how to target ads, which they're not, by the way. I've been getting ads for male adult diapers for like 3 months on Facebook, so just saying. But I'm not sure that translates into more sophisticated, complex, nuanced situations. Bernard mentioned the GEC, the Global Engagement Center. I mean, pretty much everything I've seen about the State Department's attempts to change hearts and minds have been that they've been a dismal failure, or else they haven't bothered to measure the impact. And just because somebody clicks on a link doesn't mean you've changed their mind. And you're talking often about deeply held political and religious views. So I think it's a little, I don't think that these things are, the promise of AI, I don't think is quite as much as we think it is.
So we'll try and be lightning speed here in our final comments. And I hear from Agnes that we really do need to be off the stage very shortly. But please, Adam, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. The thread, I mean, I'm an anti-racism activist, so the thread that I was picking up was the racialization, or the connection between racial minorities and the idea of who can be radicalized. And what I was really interested in is this idea, it sounds particularly from the United States, this idea that all racial minorities are somehow susceptible to being radicalized because of their resentment, which I think is such an interesting idea because it amounts to a recognition by the people in power that racial minorities have something to be upset about. And maybe there would be a way to harness that recognition into something more positive. And I think probably something that certainly I've got to do with my colleagues and other people who work in the anti-racism area need to do is find a way of positively framing expressions of resentment by minorities as an exercise of freedom of expression and not as some kind of warning sign.
Thank you. Alexander.
Thanks. I liked very much the idea of inventing insurgency. Yes, it happens very frequently, but I think there is another close mistake. It's some generalization, over-generalization. And I give an example. There are Salafi communities. I talk not about persons, but about communities. There are really militant communities and really peaceful communities. And there are some communities which are in between. And it's very difficult for a person outside really to understand it. Some people prefer not to see one side, some people prefer not to see other side. Because the society in general usually wants more simple picture. It's natural, some general framework which covers all. In Russian society, it's now about protecting traditionality. So it helps everywhere. It helps against non-traditional, so-called non-traditional Muslims, against blasphemy, against not loyal part of nationalists, LGBT, Jehovah's Witnesses, whoever. Here, as I understand, it may be about vague definition of what terrorism and anti-terrorism is. So I think it's not enough just to protect freedom of expression in this situation. We need to suggest maybe another, not so simple, but more general framework of this counter-radicalization, taking into account the plurality of dangers, plurality of sources of this radicalization. Just one more thing, that we cannot put policing in the center of this counter-radicalization approach. Of course, it's addressing your remark that sometimes abusive speech may be in certain situations more dangerous than direct incitement to violence. It happens. But it's too difficult task for police to differentiate such things. They cannot do it. So it's not up to law enforcement, I think, to do that. We have to limitate them first and then to decide more complicated issues ourselves.
Thanks, Alexander. And Bernard?
Very briefly. Just two things. I think on Agnes's point about kind of shaping, I mean, I think it's on a model of consumption. And this has to do with the flows of discourse, but it's on a model of consumption that we're becoming more and more sophisticated at. And in turning us into consumers, we're able to shape us. And politically, we are able to do that as well. It has to do with prediction. And I agree entirely with Yasmin about the problems of prediction. Actually, one of my books was called Against Prediction, so I'm totally on board with that. But I think it's even getting worse as a result of artificial intelligence. So that's all I would say, is that because of data mining and artificial intelligence, what we're doing is we're replicating patterns through artificial intelligence that even make it worse than the kind of predictive tools that we had at the beginning of the 20th century and that we still use today.
Thanks. Yasmin.
Just very quickly again, I think we really need to be really careful about talking about the link between expression and violence, and really thinking about what we mean by expression. The human rights framework, as we all know, takes account of incitement to violence and hatred. Going any further than that, when we're talking about people expressing their views about the world or particular issues, or holding ideologies, holding a particular view or having an ideology, I just think, and that, as Fisa said, that playing some kind of predictive role in determining violence, I think there's a really big issue there. And I think, again, I'm a quite a staunch freedom of expression advocate, but I think we really need to think, and I think this is a theme that's come out of this conference really, is about the extent to which we see there needing to be more restrictions on freedom of expression and when that's appropriate, and just, I think, being careful when, as a community, when we're doing that because of the broader implications. Because I think one of the things that's underlined the idea of freedom of expression and the idea that it has very minimal restrictions is that freedom of expression itself is an incredibly important counter to some of the social ills that we've been talking about. And I think not forgetting that point is really important, whether it's problematic political discourse, whether it's issues around gender. Having an open space of dialogue is actually incredibly important. It's the foundation. So I think obviously everyone does, but just keeping that in mind, I think, is really important. I think, secondly, your question about what do we do? What are the solutions to this? I think I said it in my talk, was that I think we need to take a step back when we talk about CVE or CE, countering violent extremism or extremism, and say, what is the problem that we're seeking to identify here? If the problem is that certain people hold conservative views or problematic views, and that we agree that that links to terrorism, then I agree we need to say, what is the solution to that, and look at the solution. But I actually think we need to take a step back and say, what is the problem, and reanalyse that and think about that without diving in, first of all, and trying to answer the question. Having said that, when we say what are the solutions, I think we do have to acknowledge that in the area of CVE, there are already a plethora in all countries of criminal laws that cover not only terrorism but incitement and a whole host of ancillary offences. So the question is, do we need more than that? Is it legitimate from a policy and a legal perspective? We need to be asking that question before coming up with answers. And then finally, I think there is a real issue, as Andrew says, with this whole idea that there's a whole apparatus of CVE that's happening at the EU and the UN levels that's then trickling down, and states are then having to implement these policies that are required of them, and there's very, very little discussion around what the human rights impact is of these policies, often, as I said, because they're conceived of as the softer approach to terrorism. So I think it's really important to insert that dialogue.
Thank you, Yasmin. Joelle, last words.
Right, so I'd like to answer Bernard's question, which was the question of the ask. So what do we want from governments and social media? So governments, one recommendation, in my context at least, repeal blasphemy laws. Just repeal them. How on earth are you meant to have a discussion about violence in the name of religion without having a religious exchange? How is that possible? So the whole debate about violence in the name of religion is hijacked because of that question. So, for example, after the attacks in January 2015 on the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, we saw a great positive momentum. Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Malta, possibly Ireland on the way. They've repealed the blasphemy laws. That's my recommendation to governments. My recommendation to social media companies: protect users and enforce international standards on freedom of expression. That's it. If a comment around religion does not incite to violence, it is not radical speech. As simple as that.
Great. Well, what a terrific panel. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the rapid fire responses.